Chapter 9. Why Physics Does Not Save Freedom of the Will. Whenever the discussion about freedom starts to become uncomfortable, physics is often summoned into the conversation. The expectation is almost always the same. If the world is not entirely predictable, if matter itself displays strange behaviors and probabilistic outcomes, then perhaps there is a crack there, a gap in which human freedom, as imagined in common sense, could still stand. When the laws seem to fail, one thinks the will could escape. This reasoning is seductive and mistaken. Science has never been a consistent ally of the idea of free will as it is understood in everyday language. That is, as the ability to choose freely out of nothing, always having been able to do otherwise under the same conditions. At most, science has offered new vocabularies for old confusions. The most recurring one is the belief that unpredictability equals freedom. Unpredictable does not mean free. It only means that we are not able to anticipate the outcome. For a long time, it was believed that classical physics described a perfectly predictable universe, like a great mechanism. If we knew all positions and velocities, we could calculate the entire future. When that ideal began to collapse, whether because of the extreme complexity of systems or because of the limits revealed by quantum mechanics, many saw in that an opportunity to recover lost freedom. But that hope is born from a simple conceptual error, confusing limits of knowledge with absence of causality. Much of what we call chance or randomness is merely complexity at a level we cannot track. The weather changes in unexpected ways, but not because it is free. It changes because it involves countless sensitive variables that exceed our capacity to calculate. Traffic becomes chaotic not because causes are missing, but because there are too many of them. The same applies to human behavior. When we cannot predict a decision, we are not facing freedom in the common sense meaning. We are facing practical ignorance about the causes at play. Quantum mechanics is often invoked as the last refuge. People speak of particles with no definite position until they are measured, of outcomes that can only be expressed in probabilities. From this, many conclude that reality is indeterminate at its base and that, therefore, free choosing would be saved. But that conclusion does not follow from what was observed. Even if there are fundamental events whose outcome cannot be predicted, not even in principle, that does not create common sense free will. A probabilistic result is not a chosen result. It does not express intention, preference, or deliberation. It simply happens. If a human decision depended on a random physical process, that would not make it freer in the popular sense of the term. It would only make one of the causes in the process inaccessible to conscious prediction. The will would still arise as a result of what the agent is. Only an additional variable would have been introduced. There is yet another frequent confusion, often presented in an almost mystical way, the idea that the observer creates reality. It is said that the outcome changes because someone observed it, as if consciousness had the power to bend the world to its will. But observing was never a neutral act. Measuring is interacting. Observing is interfering. To measure the position of a particle, something must happen to it. Energy is exchanged. The system is altered. The outcome changes not because someone looked, but because something was done. There is no suspension of laws there, only more laws in operation. The double-slit experiment is often cited as proof that the observer creates reality. This reading, though popular, is conceptually mistaken. In the experiment, the so-called observer is not a consciousness that decides to look, but a physical device that interacts with the system. Observing, in this context, means measuring, and measuring is intervening. The outcome changes not because someone became aware of it, but because the system ceased to be isolated. There is no intention, choice, or will acting on the outcome. There is only causal interaction. Turning this physical phenomenon into proof of freedom of the will is again confusing limits of knowledge with a suspension of laws. Physics does not reveal loopholes for absolute choice. It only reveals how careful we must be when interpreting what we do not yet fully understand. Physics, when properly understood, offers no shelter for the idea of common sense free will. It does not reveal a universe without structure where the human could hide. It reveals a deeply regular universe, though complex, in which events follow rules, even when we cannot describe them completely. This does not diminish science, nor does it diminish the human being. It simply puts each thing in its place. To expect freedom to arise from a failure in the laws is to bet on error as the foundation of human dignity. It is as if we would only be free if the universe were poorly built. That is not a solid basis for any serious understanding of human experience. When we abandon this expectation, something becomes clearer. Freedom of the will, the real free will adopted in this book, was not denied by physics. It simply was never located there, not in atoms, not in particles, not in the gaps of the unknown. Perhaps the problem is not that the world is too determined, but that we expected from freedom something it never promised to deliver, or that we search for it in a place where it was never necessary. In the next chapter, we move to an even more uncomfortable point. If the will is not chosen, if choice is inevitable, if chance does not break causality, and physics offers no refuge for common-sense free will, then one decisive thing remains to be recognized, that even the degree of control we exercise over ourselves is not under our command. That is where the illusion truly begins to collapse.